people are what makes high performance. The women's game was that growth area. There was an assumption that you didn't know as much because you had that tag, woman. You have two choices, either sit and wallow in that moment or you step up. If we're going to make a sustained change, what we need to do is to firstly, when I took on this role at World Rugby, and right away, you just had that feeling that people looked at you differently when you walked into a room. You not think that that was just too much too fast. And I said, well, this organization's almost 100 years old. Fast? Not sure that that's what I would call it. It was quite a surreal moment of, you think of moments in your life and you think, did that really happen? And I just looked at them and I just said, you've got to be kidding.
My name is Kyla Colbin. You're listening to my interview with Katie Sadleir, and this is the Hunger and Heart Podcast. Enjoy the show. Hello, my name is Kyla Colbin, and welcome to episode 6 of Hunger and Heart. My guest today is Katie Sadleir. Katie is an absolute titan in global sport, both as an athlete and as a leader. She was an Olympic synchronized swimmer. She won bronze at the 1986 Commonwealth Games. She served on the New Zealand Swimming Federation Board and the New Zealand Olympic Committee Athletes Commission. She was general manager of women's rugby for World Rugby and is currently chief executive of Commonwealth Sport. In this conversation, we talk about what the most successful coaches have in common, how she was able to add 17 women to an all-male council, and how she handled it when the state of Victoria gave her 8 hours notice that they were pulling out of hosting the Commonwealth Games. So here you are, my conversation with Katie Sadleir. Welcome to Hunger and Heart. What is your experience with wild ambition and fierce compassion?
Wild ambition and fierce compassion. I think that I've never really thought about it like that, but when I think about some of the challenges and opportunities that I've had in my career, it is very aligned to that. It's really believing passionately about what you're trying to achieve, but doing it in a way that actually brings people with you and they feel good about what it is that you're trying to achieve. So it's a fantastic topic for a podcast, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you, Kyla. Let's start. So this thing, okay, the reason that this is the topic of the podcast is because what you've just described is often, in my experience, a myth that people carry, which is that we can either be wildly ambitious or fiercely compassionate, but not both. And that, sure, compassion, that's great, or humanity, that's great, or caring for people or bringing people along, that's great. But at some point, you have to get the job done. And I have an opposite hypothesis. I'm curious about your experience of, number one, is that a phenomenon that you've observed? And B, how have you tackled that in your career? Yeah, it definitely is a phenomenon that I've observed. And there's lots of examples of it. But when I think really clearly, I think of, probably the best example was prior to me taking on this role as Commonwealth Games chief executive, where I was driving some significant transformational change. But I just want to talk about another experience that I had when I was working for World Rugby for 5 years. And I had this ambition of absolutely transforming the leadership and the decision-making within World Rugby, because I started at a period of time when it was governed by 30 men. And I had the role of, increasing the number of women involved in rugby. And everyone said to me that you'd never be able to crack this. I firmly believed that you had to be, you had to actually really focus on the decision makers and moving the decision-making makeup to actually be able to drive the transitional change you wanted to for World Rugby. But everyone said it couldn't be done, because to do that, you would have to get the men off the table to get women onto the table. And I realized that wasn't the way to do it. So what I needed to do was to work with men to drive a solution that would bring in
at the end of my first year, 17 women directors onto the board of World Rugby. So from 0 to 17. And to do it in a way that it was really tough. It was a hard decision for, because there was a lot of men that still didn't believe that women should be involved in leadership on a global level for rugby. But I did it in a way that worked alongside women to support them and create a transformational change in the leadership makeup of the organization. So that was a real, hunger to make that change really, really quickly, but to do it in a way that people weren't there as a token, that they were there because they had a huge contribution to make. So working with individuals to ensure that they shined on a world stage. So that was one example.
I have a lot of questions about that. And
Yep.
I think this is a hyper relevant topic right now, hyper timely right now. This thing of I'm going to ask questions that sound
Yep.
ridiculous. Okay. So let's assume, can we caveat for the whole conversation we're about to have, that I am absolutely pumped that you did what you did, and that I think is an extraordinary act of leadership and extraordinarily valuable act of leadership, and that I feel it has all the merit in the world. Okay. So with all those caveats,
Yep.
I'm going to ask a bunch of questions that might sound like I'm challenging what you did.
Yep.
But it's because we're in a time right now where these are the kinds of challenges that people are hearing to this kind of leadership.
Yep.
So my first question is, how did you make the case? Like, how were you able to get that buy-in for adding 17 women to the governance table? And how did you make the case that these 17 women were not tokens?
Yeah. So there was two. I mean, I guess I was really fortunate when I started at World Rugby that I had a chief executive and a guy called Brett Gosper and a chair, Sir Bill Beaumont, who were passionate about transformational change. And they knew that the women's game was the growth area. We just came out of the Rio Olympics. Women's sevens was on the rise. Go Blackburns. They knew that that other sports were grabbing the women's market, but they knew that they needed to have someone like me bring in a disruptor to actually challenge everything that we were doing to make sure that we were driving a transformational change to create women in rugby. So first of all, I had those two people who were supporting me. But I remember, so we developed I listened and learned and spent a lot of time with a lot of men because there wasn't a lot of women in that leadership space at the time, and kind of just got a feel for what they saw was the biggest obstacles that needed to be changed. And a lot of them were talking about, let's just get more money into the game, or get more women coaches, or put more money into grassroots women. And fundamentally, I kind of sort of sat down with Brett and Bill to say, if we're going to make a sustained change, what we need to do is to firstly deal with the decision makers. And it was funny because at the time, we were talking about quotas. We were talking about quotas, and we were talking about whether or not we needed to put some kind of requirements on the unions, that the national governing bodies of rugby around the world. And I remember sitting down and I said, so what's the point of doing that, guys? I mean, look at us. We can't do anything like that if we don't fix our own problem here. And so then we sat down, and Bill, I mean, he was classic because he was such a great supporter of women's rugby. And he said to me, I know, I've got the answer. I have the answer. There's 30 men on the council, highest decision-making body of rugby for women and men. And he said, we'll add another vice president and we'll make that a woman vice president. And I said, Bill, I like where you're going, but one woman on a board of 30 is not going to crack it. If we're going to do something symbolic that's going to start changing and coming across to all our members that we mean business, we need to do something significant. So we then sat down and said, well, what could we do? And we worked out that there was a loophole in our constitution. And it kind of went like this. World Rugby used to pay for two people to come and be part of, for the top 10 unions to be part of the council. And yet they had 3 votes. So each of those unions, so New Zealand Rugby Union would have 3 votes. And what we decided to do was to change the 3-vote policy to sort of say that third vote was actually linked to the fact that you brought a woman with you. So instead of giving you 3 votes for 2 people, you got 3 votes for 3 people. And that was the thing that changed. That was the business case, because it meant you had 3 people at council, just one of them had to be a woman. And it was embraced. So were there people that were upset? It was funny. I remember I spoke at a conference. This is a really funny story. I think it was a sports medicine conference, and we were past year 1, and we were talking about, because we got some other momentous things done. And I always talk about the fact that we got 17 women directors in 1 year. And I had someone in the audience say to me, Katie, look, I like what you're doing, and I can see where it's going. But do you not think that that was just too much, too fast? And I said, well, this organization's almost 100 years old. Fast, not sure that that's what I would call it. But anyways, so I then make sure, at the same time as driving that change, I also got the executive committee of World Rugby to invest in a significant leadership development program. Not saying that the woman needed the additional leadership, but I thought, well, if there are people that are out there that think that these women don't have these skills, give me a pocket of money, and I will work with people on an individual basis to make sure that they have the competencies and skills that they think they require to be on the board. And we did all sorts of things. So that launched a huge leadership mentoring program that took place. I think there's now about 69 women who've been on Capgemini sponsored professional development, but at the time we were doing that ourselves and paying for it out of World Rugby. So yeah, it was a rapid change, and it certainly got noticed by a lot of other international federations, but it was meaningful. And the result of that now is, because you couldn't chair committees or be on any subcommittees of World Rugby unless you were on council, but women are everywhere now in terms of chairing committees and on every kind of committee, including the executive.
Okay, so first of all, 3 cheers to you for what you, I have lots of thoughts and comments and questions, but first of all, 3 cheers to you for what you did, because extraordinary. Second of all, 3 cheers to Bill and Brett. Like, wow, what
Absolutely, the ambassadors. Yep.
Yeah, and because if you can't get the champions from the people who are currently in positions of power, then your only choice is to either blow it up or leave. And so, 3 cheers to them. Somewhat ironic that, you at the helm of World Rugby, able to drive such massive change. And of course, here in Aotearoa, we had, NZR was the only organization that couldn't meet the obligation to have a certain number of women on the board. I have a couple of thoughts, and I have some questions about how you did it. So the first thought that I have is, if you think about, we'll get 1 vice president versus 17, and that thing of, is it too much, too fast? My observation or my hypothesis is, if we have 1, first of all, that 1 person, almost certainly to fail. You're the only woman. You're clearly the token. Like, it doesn't matter how skilled you are. You're the only one, and everyone, it's so visible that you're the only one. Like, of course, the dynamic is going to be brutal and painful, and the likelihood of failure is so high. And so having 17 at once is almost, like, if you're gonna do it, if it has any hope of succeeding, you need a kind of escape velocity to be able to get in, so that people go, oh, right, this is like part of, there are a bunch of women and a bunch of men in there. You mentioned quotas, and what I heard you say is the original conversation was, do we make them have quotas? And then you said, well, what are we doing ourselves? We got 30 men on the board, on the council. So quotas is a thing that I'm super fascinated by, because it is one of those words that is, I think, the most likely to trigger, but don't you want the best person for the job kind of reaction. And I told you I was going to say a lot of things that are like, I needed to caveat all of my positions at the beginning. But one of the things that's most likely to trigger, we want the best person for the job. And it is something that I got really challenged on. I told you several years ago, I attended a panel put on by the wonderful Global Women organization. And I don't remember who all was on the panel. Dame Marilyn Waring was one of them on the panel. And they were talking about quotas. And it completely changed my mind of like, oh no, I went in like anti-quota and I came out fully pro-quota. And I went in anti-quota not because of the merit thing, but because of the risk of triggering the merit thing. Like it felt like scary to me. And now I came away like, oh no, like having those hard requirements is the way we get. Can you talk to me about that kind of that quota versus merit kind of conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I probably was the same as you. I mean, it's interesting for so much of my career. I mean, when I was living in New Zealand, for the majority of my career, I was leading the high performance system, and there was not a lot of women involved in high performance sport at that stage. And so I was often the only woman in the room, often the only woman in the room. But, what we did at rugby at the same time as doing this change is that we created a resource for all the unions called Balancing the Board, which was it didn't talk to quotas, but it talked about the importance of diversity in balancing the board. And it talked to good practice. So we used examples of unions where they bought into diversity, and with that, you got a balanced board. But one of the challenges in a sports world when it comes to quotas and women on boards and things like that is, although I can absolutely say of my 5 years that was at World Rugby, that different types of decisions were made faster because of the change in dynamics and diversity on the board. I can talk about the fast-tracked way that we got on women's rugby. But the real challenge, I think, sometimes when we talk about quotas and boards is that all the research, that the McKinsey does and all the management consultancies are not necessarily in sports organizations. They talk about changes to the bottom line, et cetera, but there's not a lot of case studies in sports. So I think it's something I'm going to write up at some stage in my life. But I think you need quotas because it's that kind of catalyst for change. Over time, you possibly don't, because people have woken up to the sense that and I think of it like I quite often think about how quite often you get to the sort of situation where they think that women haven't got as much to contribute at a board level, and on what basis. So I do believe in quotas when you are developing and transforming change. I think over time, when organizations are more balanced, like our board at the Commonwealth Games Federation is kind of 50-50 in terms of its makeup. And there is a constitutional remit for making sure that there's a minimum of 40% of either gender. A lot of our members have that now in place as well. And I think it just drives diversity and balance on your board.
Yeah, I would say, like, I imagine looking at a council of 30 men and what woman is going to put her hand up to apply for the open seat, right? Like it's just, you're not going to do it.
No, it wouldn't happen. And then it became, it's funny because that whole transformation became such rich content in terms of the other aspects. So, I mean, when I was driving the change in World Rugby, there was kind of 5 streams to the work. One was leadership, and I knew we had to get that right. And that was leadership at a high level, and it was leadership on field too. So we did a lot on developing women coaches, because I mean, it was back in the day when you had a World Cup and none of the coaches of the women's teams were coached by women. I mean, there was just none. So, how do you actually transfer and get that kind of stuff moving? But the other for women's rugby was to drive a new dedicated commercial strategy that was about women's rugby, where it wasn't just a tag on to the men's rugby. So, but to do that, you had to actually lift the profile of women's rugby, and you needed stories about people. And the people who got on the board provided great, rich stories as part of my content strategy.
Amazing. So I was going to ask, you have these 17 women on the board. You've already mentioned you've got faster decision-making in some instances. You've got rich content coming out. Was there anything else that you could point to that you go, this was the difference that was made by having these additional people on the board? Or what kinds of decisions were made faster? I imagine,
investment, proper, the investment in the women's game.
Yeah.
And the decision making from the men, because of the women were there, so that was just like a no-brainer. So huge increase in investment in the women's game, and that was fantastic. We brought in place, in the women's game, there's a new global competition called WXB, which was about driving women's 15s program around the games and getting women around the world to agree an international competition calendar. That happened reasonably fast compared to, the kind of antics that happened in the men's game. So new competitions, a new commercial strategy that was separate, just really fast. I mean, the changes that were made, and then also in growth, the growth of the games during that period of time and now in countries that you just would not expect women's rugby to grow, was just fascinating. And I think that all came from, changing the leadership at a global level. And then that gave us the mandate to actually look at what was going on in some of the unions.
It's amazing. Yeah, I just had a conversation recently with Richie McCaw, and he was talking about the work that he does now in organizations, now that he's retired from rugby. And his comment was that if you don't get it from the leadership, nothing else is going to happen. And so starting at that level was, I think, the catalyst. I mean, not having been in those rooms with you, but the catalyst for all of those other changes. How do you get all those other changes when you're kind of constantly fighting what's happening from the top? One of the things I want to Mickey to you for is your approach of going, I've got these 30 men. I don't want to take seats away from the men. I don't want to be fighting against the men. I want to be bringing them with me. And my observation is that sometimes these conversations end up getting pitted as an either or. And as soon as they get pitted as an either or, we end up with these massive challenges and massive antagonism. There is a very valid, essential conversation about how do we get women on the board. And that conversation does not need to be how do we get men off the board. No. And so tell me, how the work that you did, I don't want you to name names or talk out of school, but the more tangible and specific of how do you approach those conversations with those men to go, no, this is not about replacing you. This is not about not valuing your contribution. This is about going, how do we grow the whole pie and it all gets richer? How do you approach those conversations?
Yeah, well, firstly, it absolutely helped to have Bill championing this change. So he personally called all the top unions to talk about why this was really important and that we needed to make this happen. We also had, our director of international relationships, a guy called David Kerrigan. He was, absolutely on top of all the constitutional issues, and he was the one who saw the loophole and said, if we push this and we drive this, then we will get there. And so when you had two people like that who were so integral to getting the change across, are you going to vote against the president on this? I mean, are you going to vote against the president? And then I guess I think it also helped. I mean, when I took on the job at World Rugby, and I sort of said, I think they employed me because I was a bit of a disruptor. I mean, I came because I wanted to make a difference for women in a sport that was growing really fast. So, I've always had that mandate that I wasn't here to be popular. I was there to be professional. And that if I was going to ruffle a few feathers along the way, then so be it. You've brought me in to drive this change. So I need to make sure that I've got your backing to do so. And if you don't like what's going on, well, then, obviously there's options. But for the time that I was there, we just saw such rapid transformation in the game for women across all spheres. I mean, the other thing I did, which was about, helping getting more people on board, is I made the strategic call, not at this time I was there, not to have a unit of people. So I came in as the director of women's rugby, and decided that the way to drive change was, rather than have a whole unit of people that dealt with competitions and performance and leadership and coaching, etc., was that I would work with the chief executive to actually drive the change and put the kind of transformation we want to see in all the senior leadership team's job descriptions. So it became the high performance rugby people's role to drive women's rugby, and I worked with them on that rather than set up a women's high performance union. And that was quite critical to do that, because it meant that your the people that were driving the change was more than just you. So it became other people's KPIs. And that was great. And the CEO worked with me. He said, I will work across the organization to make sure that the KPIs are there to drive the change. So I think that was a real key.
And it's also not that's the women's thing that's happening over there in the corner.
Well, I mean, when I arrived, Kyla, there was this box of things on my desk, and it was like, because it had the word woman in it, it was stuck on the woman's desk. And I looked, and the first thing I did was open this box, distribute it around World Rugby, and said, this is an eligibility issue. This is a competition issue. This is a finance, because if you kind of kept it in that kind of space, you didn't share the love in terms of the transformation.
It's interesting, right? We think about like what we call the dominant paradigm, right? Which is, and I would say out of New Zealand and the UK and the US, the dominant paradigm is white, straight, cisgendered, neurotypical, able-bodied male. And when I talk about the dominant paradigm, I align to the dominant paradigm in every way except my gender. And one of the ways we notice what the dominant paradigm is what are the adjectives we use to describe deviation from the dominant paradigm, right? And so if our dominant adjective for like this thing is, it's a woman thing, as opposed to it's a competition thing, then that's the indicator this is the deviation from the dominant paradigm. What we did is said, no, that's not the interesting characteristic. The interesting characteristic is that it's a competitions thing, or that it's a coaching thing, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I found that very much so, is that, when I took on that role, it was the first time. So I had been in leadership positions in New Zealand sport for years and years and years. I guess my legacy when I left the country was I was responsible for setting up the New Zealand high performance system. But when I took on this role at World Rugby, I became a director of women's rugby. And right away, you just had that feeling that people looked at you differently when you walked into a room. There was an assumption that you didn't know as much because you had that tag woman. Like you could visibly feel it in the conversations. And I looked at my experience and my background. I mean, I had a huge, one of my huge jobs I had when I was in New Zealand, when I was on the board of Sport New Zealand, High Performance Sport New Zealand. So I always stayed in sport, I was the director of corporate services at ACC. So a really large corporate services crown entity job. Took on this role at World Rugby and went back into quite a container, although I had a global brief, but people just assumed that you didn't have any skills. It was just hilarious because of the word woman in that title. So that's kind of fascinating. But so that was a real learning for me, and that kind of bias that people have.
I want to come back to a phrase that you used, which I really loved, which was, I'm not here to be popular, I'm here to be professional. And one of the drivers of this podcast is the myth that we carry that getting the job done is unkind, and that these are differences, right? Like, yeah, you can empathize all you want, but at some point you have to get the job done. And we don't know each other well, but in the conversations that we've had, one of the things that has struck me so much is like, I would not mess with this. Like, you seem incredibly kind and obviously driven by purpose and impact. And I wouldn't fuck with you. Like, I wouldn't want to be on the opposite side of the negotiating table. So can you talk to me a little bit about your approach? And again, specific stories always welcomed, but like where you've had to take a hard line in a way that you're like, actually, I don't feel like I'm being mean at all. I'm being clear. This is what I will put up with and what I won't.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are ways of doing things and getting things done that you don't have to be a horrible person to do it. I mean, I think when people describe me as a leader, they think I'm very much people first. But I am very focused on achieving what's best for the organization. But I do definitely, I care about people. And so from that perspective, I've always had that philosophy, when you work in sport and you have a knowledge of high performance sport, that that the coaches that know their athletes in a 24-hour sense get the most out of those athletes. That they're not just, they're not just there and you just give them instruction. You got to know what makes them tick. You got to know what motivates them. You got to create the right environment for them to succeed. So I really do believe in in people and people strategies. But sometimes, I guess I've been in some pretty high pressured situations at various times in my career. And you have to, set the direction that you want to go in and move quite quickly. Hope that you've developed enough credits in the bank that you've got people that are following you, and usually they are. And I mean, I guess one of the examples that I would give is, and I think it was when Victoria pulled out of the Commonwealth Games on July 17th, 2 years out from when it was supposed to happen in Australia. So I switched from the rugby world to my current role, which is the Chief Executive of the Commonwealth Games Federation. That was an incredibly high pressured situation where I was literally, myself and the president were given 8 hours notice that they were pulling out of hosting the Commonwealth Games. And
Can
it was
we
one of those.
contextualize this for a moment?
Yep.
I want to hear this entire story. Can
Okay.
we just contextualize this for a moment? Like, I come from an events background.
Yep.
How many years out do you select the host city or region?
Normally, I guess, I've been on board for 3 years, and there were, I guess, a couple of speed wobbles in the period leading into that. So I arrived in this role just in November 21, and we had a Birmingham Commonwealth Games in 2022, which was absolutely amazing. So that was my first as a CEO role. But we would normally hand out or award games, 4 to 7 years out. But what had happened when I arrived was basically South Africa had to, the games from South Africa had to be removed, and Birmingham or the UK were planning on doing the games in 26, and the games in 22 were supposed to be in South Africa. And so what happened was, for a variety of reasons, the games needed to come out of South Africa, and the UK put up its hand, and Birmingham got the games. And so when I started, there wasn't a pipeline. But I arrived in November, and by December, we had an approach from the state of Victoria saying we would like to be considered for the Commonwealth Games in 26. So it was a reasonably short period of time. By the time we, 3-4 months on, we had signed a contract with them. But still
4 or 5 years lead time.
22. It was a 4-year lead in time. But that in an ideal world, you might have longer, although we've just been working on a games reset, which actually I think shortens the planning time. But anyway, so they had the games in hand. Were there, and they got the passing of the flags at the closing ceremonies of Birmingham. And we kept managing the games. And then July 17th, 23, we got this request to have a meeting with a couple of people that were coming to the UK. And so my president came down, and we welcomed them into our offices, and showed them around the offices. And then they sat down, opened up their computer, and said, "Oh, this will be quite disturbing news for you, but in 8 hours time, the premier of the state of Victoria is going to announce that Victoria is pulling out of hosting the Commonwealth Games." And I just looked at them, and I looked at Dame Louise Martin, who is the president, and I sort of said, "Well, firstly, there's no provision." Like you thought, are they kidding? I was sitting on the board. I said, there is no provision for the state of Victoria to pull out from the Commonwealth Games. Really, the only people who can pull out is ourselves. And so I suggest that you go away and come back when I have my lawyers and my comms people present, and then let's have a discussion. And so then that kind of triggered 24 hours of absolute madness. So them coming back after, when I got all the people around me that I needed to, woke up the Chief Executive of Commonwealth Games Australia, who of course was sleeping. I thought I better tell him that when he wakes up in the morning, he's going to watch this on the news. Had an urgent board meeting, and then worked through the strategic comms of how we were going to handle this. So went to what I call 3 phases of, the first was, make sure the family knows first, and do all you can to actually, come out with a statement of factually where things are at. That was challenging because we took a while for them to share the statements that they were going to put out in Victoria, but we got them in the end. And then managed the messy divorce is what I called, which was the next phase of, well, you can't do this, so you're going to have to pay for it. And they had a figure that they thought was acceptable. And they said that they had come there with the instruction from the Premier to negotiate this exit because they realized it was going to be quite challenging. It'd be fair to say that the figure that they put forward was nowhere near acceptable. So we decided to go to mediation, or we were going to go to court. So then managing the messy divorce took place over the next 3 months, 2-3 months. We came down and we sat in. That was another case of I talked about earlier being the only woman in the room. I think there was 18 lawyers and administrators and myself in this negotiation process. Ended up negotiating a deal worth 380 million Australian for Victoria to get out, and then absolutely with passion focused on what I called the speed dating exercise of finding a replacement. And that was a massive exercise. I mean, right away, lots of countries put up their hand and said, we're interested. A lot of that was great, passionate people. There was quite a few in New Zealand, actually, who said, we could do it. We want to do it. It's our turn. But, they hadn't sort of sat down and worked through the numbers and actually realized that, it's a big exercise hosting a Commonwealth Games. So we then decided that we would incentivize a host for 2026 and got the board to sign off on putting 100 million in, whereas normally we get the money out of the games, and went through an exercise where we eventually got to the stage where we agreed that Glasgow would host the games. But that was a fascinating period of time, because it wasn't about, I was feeling really, really strongly aware that, it was really important for athletes and for our members, particularly members that are just Commonwealth Games associations and not Olympic associations. So that, not having a Commonwealth Games in 2026 was going to be significant in terms of who their funders were and all that kind of stuff. And that we needed the games because of the profile that Commonwealth Games gives us. So it was going to be a massive exercise to do. But at one stage we did think, because it's a hard exercise, we did think, should we just put this on hold and wait till 2030? But we persevered, worked with Glasgow, and now we are almost 500 days to go. So it's approaching really fastly. I'm on the board of the Glasgow Games, and it will be fantastic.
I have to ask, this story, I just imagine myself as the event organizer with the venue or the host city or state or region telling me they're about to pull out. I'm going to ask you a question that you might not recall or might not have an answer to.
Yep.
I imagine myself in that situation, and I'm imagining the moment that they're saying, this is going to come as a nasty shock and we're about to pull out. And I just imagine my body just the whole, all the horror and viscera, right now, as you're telling the story, you're smiling and laughing and, it sounds kind of easy.
Oh my God.
Can you talk to me about that moment? What's going through your body? What's going through your mind? How do you cope in that pressure moment?
Yeah. It was, I think, I think I've always been someone all my life that I do. It sounds terrible, but some people perform better under pressure than they do when it's a bit of a cruisy number. When I was young at school, my parents used to give me a day off a month, so I was just slightly behind, so I would excel in my coursework. So being a little bit under pressure is something that I excel in, but that was big. No one saw that coming, and we thought that we were going to be told that there was going to be a change to the Premier, because there had been this, and they're now the lady who's the Premier of Victoria, Jacinda. She was the minister for the Commonwealth Games, and we thought that maybe that's what we were being told, because it was so important that we sit down and meet with them. But you're quite right. We sort of toured around the office, showing them the mascots and the batons, the Queen's batons, and all the kind of memorabilia. They were taking pictures, and then they sat down, opened up their computers, and read a script, just read the script to us. And I just looked to them, and I just said, "You've got to be kidding." And I kind of just decided that it was so severe that I just needed to have time with the president to work out the next step. So I basically just shut down the conversation. And I said, well, you may think that you're telling us this, but until I have a team, the wraparound team that gives us the legal and particularly the legal advice, I'm not going to enter into this conversation with you. And then we let them go. And it was really funny, you know, the lifts weren't working. We're on the third floor of a building in Storey's Gate, right opposite Westminster Abbey, right downtown London. The lifts weren't working. And I think about, you know, how many times we sent the lawyer from the state and a senior manager from the state of Victoria away, and they had to go down and up the stairs, down up the stairs. They were always coming back up puffed because I kept saying, no, go, we need more time, we need more time. But yeah, it was quite a surreal moment. And I think of, you know, you think of moments in your life and you think, did that really happen? And then, but then you have two choices, don't you? You either sit and wallow in that moment, or you step up. And I'm CEO of this organization, so it was my role to step up. And that 24 hours, and we worked right through the night because it was, you know, the stakeholder comms was hugely significant. And then we knew, I mean, these guys were staying for a week, they said, to start negotiating an exit deal. We needed to try and work with them on what might be possible, but by the end of the week we realized there's just no way. And so, you know, so that week was hard too. And then we had a bit of a breather, and then we had the negotiation. That was fascinating. But yeah, I mean, surreal, but you either, yeah, when you're facing those kind of, oh my gosh, did they really just say that? I think you just stop, take a breath. And I guess that was me telling them, you can go now, come back in an hour. And then you make a plan, and that was the plan. You know, inform the family, make sure that they're aware of what's going on, manage this messy divorce and get the most you can out of it, and then start the speed dating exercise.
There are a bunch of things I want to highlight, reinforce, pull out from what you're talking about here. So one of them is what I heard you say of being someone who's always thrived under pressure, or maybe even outperformed under pressure. I love that story. Your parents, how did your parents know to hold you back a day so you'd have more pressure and better perform? Like visionary parents, go your parents. What I hear in that is that you have been rehearsing pressure your entire life.
Yeah.
And so as the stakes get higher and higher, you adapt, like each additional step. That's that moment, which for the vast majority of people would be absolutely devastating. You'll have a like, what is happening thing, but there'll be a part of your system. And when I say system, I mean, you know, your physical body, your thoughts, your emotions, like the totality that is you. There'll be a part of your system that is like, oh, this is a pressure situation. I'm familiar with pressure situations. I know what to do. Yep. And so this idea of going, actually, the way we grow our skill of being able to respond in super high pressure situations is by practicing responding in lower pressure situations, but in situations that still put us under pressure, right? That's a skill that grows. And then your immediate reaction was time out. Like, I need a moment to gather thoughts, to gather my people, to whatever. And so I wanted to, again, just highlight that of something so important in terms of your reaction of oftentimes when we're under pressure, and when we're under pressure in a way that's too big of a gap from the pressure we've rehearsed previously, then we panic, we scramble, we say things we shouldn't say. We do also, you know, we try to move faster. And in doing so, we can create more problems than what we alleviate. And so this ability to go, actually, my job here is to stay calm, to gather the information I need to make sure I'm entering into this conversation from a place of strength and from a place of presence and a place of courage. So another thing I want to have. I love that you were like, was there a part of you that was like, go climb the stairs again, you assholes? Like, what? I love the lifts.
Dare you take that picture with Perry from Birmingham? No, there. I mean, there was. I mean, because, who does that? Who does that? I mean, I really feel sorry for Australians because the next, 12 months, actually, they're still doing it and apologizing on behalf of Dan Andrews. I mean, it cost them a fortune to get out of hosting. I mean, so they paid us 380 million. I don't know how much that was our fee, 380 million. They had a lot of people employed. They had a lot of contracts in place. I mean, it was a significant cost to pull out of the Commonwealth Games.
Wouldn't it have been cheaper to stay in?
Well, one would have thought so. But anyways, I mean, it happened and you move on. But yeah, I think the other thing about me and my background is I'm a planner. I am a planner. So I like to, not that I'm not prepared to make quick decisions. Absolutely. If you need to, you do. But I do like to stop, think, okay, who are the people that are affected by this? How do we make sure that we develop a really cool, robust stakeholder plan to make sure that that those people know that we're on top of this? Not what we planned, really, really not what anyone would have planned, but we have a plan to make sure that we get through this in a way. And that was really hard. And because, the other thing I was going to sort of say about the pressure sometimes of this job, and it was fine for us because, by the time I got to the negotiation bit of, getting the 380 million out of the state of Victoria, that was fine for us. All of a sudden, we had a lot of money in the bank. Yeah, we didn't have a games, but we had a lot of money in the bank. But for all our members who didn't have a games and who actually, a lot of them exist just to go to the games, how secure was their future? So that's the real pressure for me and the Commonwealth Games Federation was to get another games in place ASAP. And if we couldn't, the other work stream that we did at the same time was to look at alternative concepts that we would put in place beyond having a Commonwealth Games in 26, and we would focus on 2030. But we got that over the line. But yeah, stop, think, plan, act.
The other thing that I wanted to highlight, and you've just, again, reiterated it so beautifully. So we run a program called the Crusaders Leadership Programme, which I've shared with you. And one of the participants on our program, we have one running right now, and one of the participants shared a concept with us just the other day that we all kind of were quite taken by, which is the idea of, in a pressure situation or under ambiguity, or when decisions need to be made, thinking about what's important now and what's important next. So win-win, right? Which I love it because it's so easy to remember. What's important now, what's important next. And the thing that I wanted to highlight from everything I've heard you say is, when we think about what's important now, you said a bunch of times, family first. How do we inform the family? Just now you talked about the stakeholders. There's this thing there of the compassion and empathy. When I say compassion and empathy, a lot of people think that's like, oh, you poor thing, compassion. That's not what I'm talking about at all. There's a thing there going, what is important here is athletes who have been training for years, and saying it's going to happen in 4 years' time does not help them, because that's not a viable option. It's these member organizations that this is their number one reason for existence. And what do we do to take care of them? It's keeping clear that the purpose of this organization is to uplift these member organizations and these athletes, and the impact that your commitment to sport has. And that is such a beautiful thing. That is such a beautiful. And when I hear you say, so I'm going to go to bat to argue with these people who are pulling out of their contract, I don't hear you saying, I'm going to go to bat because I want $380 million for us. I hear going, I'm going to go to bat because it's the right thing for the whole reason for this organization to exist and the impact that we're wanting to have on the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, sport is a people business. I always went, it's interesting. I was in India last week, and I was speaking at a conference, but I spent a day with their high performance system and just trying to help them think about, it's obviously a population of 1.6 billion. They got quite a lot of fourths at the Olympics. They came 71st in Paris. It was New Zealand, 11th, 5.5 million people. And I was helping them just sort of look at what's going on in their high performance system. And they're looking at bidding for the Olympics in 2036. And, they have invested incredibly heavily in world-class facilities, absolutely. But when it comes down to it, systems are only as good as they are if they have great people and they're people that care about each other. And it's that whole kind of leadership thing. And that's the same with, whether you're running a global organization or you're just running you're running a national organization, getting the right people with the right values, thinking about, that is core, is the people side of the sport business. So to me, it's fundamental. I mean, from as small as it's the first agenda item on my weekly senior or fortnightly senior leadership teams, how are our people doing? Whether it's our athletes commission, just touching base to see, what more we could do. People are what makes high performance.
Amazing. I think it was James Clear who said, we don't rise to the level of our ambition, we fall to the level of our systems. And often I think we carry this idea. It's interesting, right? Often we carry this idea that like the systems are the thing. And I so love that may be true. We don't rise to the level of ambition, we fall to the level of our systems. And the systems are nothing without the people and the care and the approach and the effort and the presence that we bring to them.
Yeah, it's so true. So true. And it's easy to forget that, when you have chaos and difficult things happening outside the organization, to not remember that. I mean, it is, but to me, it's just so important. And when people, I know when people say to me, what is the legacy of my time in New Zealand? I look at now and I think of all the people that I've been involved in training and the jobs that they're doing all around the world in terms of high performance and just doing really great stuff. So, investing in people and making sure that it just comes around, because then they invest in people. So it's just really important.
Amazing. Katie, I feel like this is a beautiful moment to bring our conversation to an end. I have so loved talking with you. I feel like I've learned so much in this hour. And that closing comment of, we can measure our legacy by seeing the impact that it's had on other people and how much other people are thriving as a result of the work that we do or that we've been able to contribute to in some way. What a beautiful way to think about our time on this planet.
Yes, so true. So true.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us. It's been such an honor and a delight to talk with you. So appreciate you and your work, and so appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you, Kyla.
Thank you so much for listening. Please do let me know your feedback. You can reach me at hello@kylacolbin.com. I found Katie incredibly inspirational. And one thing that really stood out to me was the way she talked about rehearsing pressure, this idea that her parents put her under what I would describe as positive pressure her whole life, the kind that makes you stronger versus the kind that breaks you. And that consistent practice over time prepared her to cope with these incredibly high pressure moments in her career. It's a really great reminder for those of us who are in parenting situations to let our kids do hard things. Thanks again for listening, and be sure to tune in next week for my conversation with the Director of Athletics and Sports Leadership at the Obama Presidential Center, Joe Kennedy. Hunger and Heart is brought to you by the Crusaders Leadership Programme. Whether you're coaching under fives or a professional team, we all want the same thing: to build a culture of trust, to get the best out of your people, and to grow players into leaders. The Crusaders Leadership Program lets you get up close and personal with some of the greatest rugby legends of all time. People like Sir Wayne Smith, Sam Whitelock, Kieran Read. You'll connect with a global group of ambitious, caring coaches from a range of codes and backgrounds. And most importantly, you'll gain skills and techniques to drive impact and outcomes for your team. The Crusaders Leadership Program is a 2-week, high-intensity virtual experience. It is delivered exclusively online, accessible from anywhere. Hunger and Heart listeners get 10% off the full price of the program, use the code HUNGER at checkout. You can find out more about the Crusaders Leadership Program at crusadersleadership.com. That's crusadersleadership.com. Hunger and Heart is created by BOMA and the entire BOMA team, including Tito Bernal, Ray Jangle, Hannah Hudson, Johanna Coxon, Sunil Unka, and me, Kyla Colbin. Thanks for listening.